I controlled the largest steel empire in the world. I controlled the iron ore mines that supplied the raw material. I controlled the coal mines that provided the fuel. I controlled the limestone quarries. I controlled the railroads that transported everything. I controlled the ships that crossed the Great Lakes. I controlled the blast furnaces. I controlled the mills. I controlled the entire supply chain from earth to finished product. I controlled thousands of workers. I controlled costs down to the penny. I controlled production schedules. I controlled quality standards. I controlled distribution networks. I controlled pricing strategies. I controlled more than most men could imagine controlling, more than most leaders will ever control. But there was only one thing that truly mattered, one thing that made everything else possible, one thing that separated me from competitors who had more money, more education, more connections, more advantages than I ever had. The one thing every leader must control is not what you think. It is not your employees. It is not your costs. It is not your market. It is not your competition. The one thing you must control is yourself. Let me tell you why. And let me tell you how I learned this lesson the hard way. I was 13 years old, working in a textile factory basement, bobbin boy, the lowest position, 13 hours a day in the dark, breathing cotton dust, changing spools of thread. The work was mind-numbing. Your hands moved on their own. Your body performed the task automatically, and your mind went somewhere else just to survive the monotony. Most boys let their minds wander. They daydreamed. They thought about what they would do after work. They counted the hours until they could leave. They endured. But I did something different. I controlled where my attention went. While my hands changed spools, I watched. I watched how the machines worked. I watched how the foreman organized labor. I watched which workers were most efficient. I watched how the factory owner made decisions. I could not control the work I was assigned, but I could control what I learned from that work. This seems like a small thing, but it was everything. Because the boy next to me, doing the exact same work for the exact same pay, learned nothing. He endured the hours and collected his wages and stayed a bobbin boy his entire life. I endured the same hours and collected the same wages and learned how factories operate. I controlled my attention. I controlled what I extracted from the experience. I controlled my own education, and that made all the difference. When I became a telegraph messenger boy, the same pattern continued. My job was to deliver messages, run from office to office, hand over telegrams, wait for replies, run to the next location. Simple work. Anyone could do it. Most messengers thought of it as just running, just delivering, just collecting wages, but I controlled my focus. While I ran, I memorized street names. I memorized which businesses were where. I memorized which companies received the most messages. I memorized the names of important businessmen. I could not control what messages I was asked to deliver, but I could control what I learned from delivering them. When I waited in offices for replies, other messengers stood there bored, wasting time, enduring. I listened, I watched, I absorbed. I learned how deals were made, how business was conducted, how the wealthy spoke, how decisions happened. I controlled my attention. I controlled my learning. I controlled my preparation for opportunities I could not yet see. And when the Pennsylvania Railroad needed a telegraph operator, when they needed someone who could translate Morse code by ear, I was ready. Not because I got lucky, but because I controlled my focus for 2 years. I had taught myself a skill no one asked me to learn because I knew it would create opportunity. Other boys were equally capable of learning Morse code. They had the same access I did, the same time, the same opportunity, but they did not control their attention, they did not control their learning, they did not control their preparation, so they stayed messengers while I became an operator. This is the first lesson about control. You cannot control your circumstances. You cannot control what opportunities appear. You cannot control what hand you are dealt, but you can control your response. You can control your focus. You can control what you do with the situation you are in. Most people give up control. They react. They let circumstances dictate their emotions. They let situations determine their actions. They let external events control their internal state. And then they wonder why they feel powerless, why they feel stuck, why they feel like life is happening to them instead of being shaped by them. I decided early that I would not give up control of myself. No matter what happened around me, no matter how difficult the circumstances, no matter how limited my options, I would control my attention, my learning, my response, my preparation, myself. When I became a telegraph operator for the Pennsylvania Railroad, I learned the second lesson about control, the lesson about emotion. The railroad business was chaotic, trains broke down, schedules changed, accidents happened, emergencies arose constantly, messages came through at all hours demanding immediate response. Some operators panicked, they got stressed, they made mistakes when pressure increased, they let the chaos control them. But I learned to control my emotional state, not by suppressing emotion, but by not letting emotion dictate my actions. When an emergency message came through, I felt the urgency, but I did not let urgency make me sloppy. I controlled my hands, I controlled my accuracy, I controlled my response. When conflicting messages arrived, when priorities clashed, when everyone needed something immediately, I felt the stress, but I did not let stress make me reactive. I controlled my thinking. I controlled my prioritization. I controlled my decisions. This is the second lesson about control. You cannot control what happens, but you can control how you respond to what happens. Most leaders lose control of themselves under pressure. They become reactive. They make emotional decisions. They let stress dictate strategy. They let fear drive choices. They let anger determine responses. And this is how leaders destroy everything they built. Not through lack of skill, not through lack of knowledge, but through lack of self-control when it matters most. I watched it happen over and over. Leaders who were brilliant in calm times, who became disasters in crisis, not because the crisis was too hard, but because they could not control themselves when tested. Thomas Scott, my superintendent, taught me the third lesson about control, the lesson about ego. Scott was powerful. He made decisions that affected thousands of people. He controlled massive budgets. He had authority and influence that most men never experience. But he never let his ego control him. He listened. He asked questions. He admitted when he did not know something. He surrounded himself with people who knew things he did not know. I watched other leaders do the opposite. They let their ego convince them they knew everything. They stopped listening. They stopped learning. They made increasingly bad decisions because they could not admit they might be wrong. Their ego controlled them, and their ego destroyed them. I learned from Scott that the most important thing a leader must control is their own ego, their need to be right, their need to be the smartest person in the room. their need to have all the answers. When I started Carnegie Steel, I did not know how to make steel. I had never run a steel mill. I had never managed production at that scale, but I controlled my ego. I hired chemists who knew more about metallurgy than I did. I hired engineers who knew more about furnace design than I did. I hired accountants who knew more about cost systems than I did. I did not let my ego tell me I should know everything. I controlled my ego and admitted what I did not know. And then I learned from people who did know. This gave me an advantage over competitors who were too proud to admit gaps in their knowledge, who thought asking questions was weakness, who let their ego prevent them from learning. They knew more than I did about many things, but they stopped learning. Their ego controlled them. I controlled my ego, and I kept learning. Over time, I surpassed them, not because I was smarter, but because I controlled the ego that stops smart people from getting smarter. When I started acquiring competitors, when I began building the vertical integration that would define Carnegie Steel, I learned the fourth lesson about control, the lesson about impulse. When you have money, when you have success, when you have momentum, the temptation to expand rapidly is overwhelming. You see opportunities everywhere. You want to move on to all of them. You want to grow faster. I watched competitors expand too quickly. They bought companies they could not integrate. They entered markets they did not understand. They took on debt they could not service. They grew until they collapsed. Not because expansion was wrong, but because they could not control their impulse to expand. They confused activity with progress. They confused growth with strength. They confused more with better. I controlled my impulse. I expanded systematically. I bought iron ore mines not because I could afford them, but because they served a strategic purpose. I integrated vertically, not because it was exciting, but because it improved efficiency and captured profit that was leaking to suppliers. Every expansion served a specific strategic purpose. I was not building an empire for the sake of size. I was building a system for the sake of efficiency and control. This required controlling the impulse to do everything, to chase every opportunity, to grow as fast as possible. Most leaders cannot do this. They cannot say no. They cannot resist. They cannot control the impulse to expand. So they build empires that collapse under their own weight. I built an empire that could sustain itself because I controlled the impulse to build faster than sustainability allowed. The Homestead Strike of 1892 taught me the fifth lesson about control, the lesson about reaction. My workers struck. They demanded better wages and safer conditions. They organized. They refused to work. My first impulse was anger. How dare they? After everything I had built, after all the jobs I had created, after all the wages I had paid, they were demanding more. They were threatening my operations. They were challenging my authority. If I had acted on that impulse, if I had let anger control my response, I would have made the situation worse. I would have been publicly reactive. I would have escalated the conflict personally. Instead, I controlled my reaction. I was in Scotland. I let Henry Clay Frick handle it, not because I was avoiding responsibility, but because I knew that responding emotionally would compromise my judgment. Frick brought in Pinkerton guards. Violence erupted. People died. The strike was broken. I can tell you that I regret the violence, that I wish it had been handled differently, that I carry the weight of those deaths. But I cannot tell you that controlling my initial angry impulse was wrong, because if I had responded reactively, if I had let emotion dictate strategy, the outcome might have been worse. This is the hardest part of self-control. Sometimes controlling yourself means not acting, not responding, not reacting even when everything in you wants to react. Most leaders fail here. They react, they escalate, they let their emotions drive their strategy, and they turn manageable situations into disasters. I controlled my reaction. The situation still ended badly, but it did not end with me making emotional decisions that I would regret even more. This is the truth about self-control. It does not guarantee perfect outcomes. It does not prevent all problems. It does not make you immune to mistakes, but it prevents the worst mistakes, the ones driven by impulse, by ego, by emotion, by reaction, by lack of discipline. By the time I sold Carnegie Steel to JP Morgan, I had learned the sixth lesson about control, the lesson about knowing when to let go. I had built the largest steel company in the world. I controlled every aspect of it. I knew every number. I made every major decision. The company was an extension of me, and I could have held on. I could have kept building, or could have fought the consolidation that was happening in American industry. I could have stayed in control until I died, but I controlled the impulse to hold on. I recognized that the market was changing, that the era of independent operators was ending, that the age of massive trust was beginning, and I sold at the peak, when the company was worth the most it would ever be worth, when I could exit with maximum value. This required controlling the most powerful impulse of all, the impulse to maintain control, to stay in power, to never let go of what you built. Most leaders cannot do this. They hold on too long. They ride their companies into irrelevance. They die still trying to control what they should have let go of years earlier. I controlled the impulse to hold on. I walked away. I let go of control at exactly the right moment. And this is perhaps the most important aspect of self-control for leaders. Knowing when to stop controlling. Knowing when control becomes imprisonment. Knowing when letting go is the wisest form of control. After I sold, I had 18 years without Carnegie Steel. 18 years where I was no longer building, no longer controlling thousands of workers, no longer making operational decisions that affected millions of dollars. And I learned the seventh lesson about control, the lesson about identity. For 40 years, I'd been Andrew Carnegie, the steel magnate, the industrialist, the empire builder. My identity was my work. My worth was my wealth. My purpose was my power. When I sold, when I stepped away, when I no longer had the company to control, I had to ask myself a question I had avoided for decades. Who am I when I am not controlling anything? This is where most leaders fall apart. They cannot separate their identity from their position. They cannot exist without control. They cannot find purpose beyond power. They retire and they die, not physically at first, but psychologically. Their sense of self dies because it was built entirely on control, and when control is gone, they are gone. I struggled with this. I felt lost. I felt purposeless. I felt like I no longer mattered because I was no longer controlling a massive enterprise. But slowly, I learned to control my identity, to separate who I was from what I controlled, to find purpose beyond power, to build meaning that did not depend on maintaining control over other people or systems. I focused on philanthropy, on building libraries, on funding universities, on creating institutions that would outlast me. And this required a different kind of control, not control over others, but control over myself, control over my need to control over my attachment to power, control over my ego that said, I only mattered if I was running something. This is the final lesson about control, the most important one, the one that most leaders never learn. The ultimate form of control is controlling your need for control, controlling your attachment to power, controlling your identity so it does not depend on maintaining control over external things. Most leaders spend their entire lives trying to control more people, more resources, more markets, more everything. They think control over external things will give them security, will make them powerful, will make them matter. But the opposite is true. The more you need to control external things, the more controlled you are by that need. The more dependent you become on maintaining power, the more trapped you become in the systems you built to feel free. True control comes from not needing to control, from being secure enough in yourself that you do not need external power to feel powerful, from having an identity strong enough that it does not depend on your position. This is what I learned in those final 18 years, that the most important thing I ever controlled was not Carnegie Steel, not the vertical integration, not the supply chain, not the thousands of workers, not the millions of dollars. The most important thing I ever controlled was myself, my attention, my emotions, my ego, my impulses, my reactions, my need for control, my identity. And the moments when I controlled myself most effectively were the moments when I succeeded most completely, when I learned instead of reacting, when I asked questions instead of asserting knowledge, when I expanded strategically instead of impulsively, when I responded instead of reacted, when I let go instead of holding on, when I found purpose beyond power. The moments when I lost control of myself were the moments when I failed most completely, when I let fear drive decisions, when I let ego prevent learning, when I let anger dictate strategy, when I let attachment prevent necessary change. I built an empire, but the empire was built on self-control. Every decision that created value came from controlling myself well enough to make good decisions. Every mistake that destroyed value came from losing control of myself in moments that mattered. This is what every leader must understand. You can control circumstances to some degree. You can influence outcomes. You can direct resources. You can manage people. You can organize systems. But all of that depends on one thing: your ability to control yourself. Because the moment you lose control of yourself, you lose control of everything else. When you let emotion dictate strategy, your strategy fails. When you let ego prevent learning, your knowledge stagnates. When you let impulse drive expansion, your growth becomes unsustainable. When you let reaction replace response, your judgment suffers. When you let attachment prevent necessary change, your organization declines. Everything you do as a leader flows from your ability to control yourself, your attention, your emotions, your ego, your impulses, your reactions, your attachments, your identity. This is not easy. Controlling yourself is harder than controlling anything else, because yourself is the one thing you can never escape. You can leave a job, you can change circumstances, you can avoid situations, but you cannot avoid yourself. You are always there with your fears, your ego, your impulses, your emotions, your attachments, your needs, your insecurities, all of it, always present, always demanding, always threatening to take control when you are not vigilant. And leadership is constant vigilance, constant awareness, constant effort to maintain control of yourself, even when everything is pulling you toward reaction, toward emotion, toward ego, toward impulse. Most people cannot sustain this. They control themselves sometimes in some situations when things are calm, when stakes are low, when it is easy, but they lose control when it matters, under pressure, in crisis, when emotions run high, when stakes are enormous, when it is hard. And this is where leaders are separated, not by skill, not by knowledge, not by intelligence, but by the ability to maintain control of themselves when everything is pushing them to lose control. I was not the smartest industrialist. I was not the most educated. I was not the best connected. I did not have the most advantages. I started with less than most of my competitors, but I controlled myself better, more consistently, in more situations, under more pressure, for more years, and that self-control compounded. It led to better decisions, which led to better outcomes, which led to more resources, which led to more opportunities, which led to more success. Not because I was better, but because I controlled myself better, because I maintained control when others lost it, because I disciplined my attention and emotions and ego and impulses and reactions and attachments and identity. That is the one thing every leader must control, not their market, not their competition, not their employees, not their costs, not their circumstances, themselves, their own mind, their own emotions, their own impulses, their own reactions, their own ego, their own attachments, their own identity. Control that, and everything else becomes possible. Lose that, and everything else becomes impossible. No matter how skilled you are, no matter how much you know, no matter what resources you have, no matter what opportunities appear, if you cannot control yourself, you cannot lead. If you cannot discipline your own mind and emotions and reactions, you cannot discipline an organization. If you cannot manage yourself, you cannot manage others. If you cannot control your internal state, you cannot control external outcomes. This is the ruthless truth about leadership, the thing no one wants to hear, the thing that sounds simple but proves incredibly difficult. The one thing every leader must control is the one thing most leaders never master, themselves. And that is why most leaders fail, not because circumstances defeated them, but because they defeated themselves, because they lost control of the one thing they actually could control. I controlled the largest steel empire in the world, but the only control that truly mattered was the control I maintained over myself. Everything else was built on that foundation. Everything else depended on that discipline. Everything else flowed from that single source. Control yourself, and you can control anything. Lose control of yourself, and you control nothing, no matter what titles you hold, no matter what authority you have, no matter what power you possess. That is the one thing every leader must control. I learned it over 50 years of building and leading and succeeding and failing. I learned it through mistakes that cost millions and decisions that created billions. I learned it through moments of triumph and moments of regret. And now I am telling you, so you do not have to learn it the hard way, so you can start with the understanding I had to earn through decades of experience. The one thing you must control is yourself. Everything else is secondary. Everything else is dependent. Everything else is impossible without that foundation. Control yourself. That is the lesson. That is the answer. That is the one thing every leader must master. And if you can do that, if you can maintain that control consistently over time under pressure, you can lead anything. You can build anything. You can achieve anything. But if you cannot control yourself, nothing else matters. No skill, no knowledge, no opportunity, no resource, None of it will save you from the failure that comes from losing control of yourself. That is what I learned. That is what made the difference. That is what I am telling you now. The one thing every leader must control: yourself. Control that, and everything becomes possible.